All right, so we've just gone past one, so let's get going. Hi everybody, and welcome to the Loughborough University CRCC seminar series. My name is Rachel. I'm a PhD student within the CRCC, and I'll be chairing today's session. We're really very lucky and fortunate to have with us today Professor Daphne Halikiopoulou. I hope I pronounced that right. I've been practicing. And she's going to be presenting today on right-wing populism in the West, the new nationalism revisited. And I think we can agree, as I was just saying, the events of the past week, this is a very pertinent topic to be discussing right now. So in terms of format, Daphne will speak for maybe 30 to 40 minutes, after which we will provide an opportunity for questions. Obviously, we all know the drill by now, but if we can keep microphones on mute throughout, that would be handy, obviously until we get to questions, at which point, if you want to ask something, please do feel free to turn your camera on, turn your mic on, and come and ask those questions on screen. Otherwise, you're welcome to ask questions in the chat too, and we'll be monitoring that. If you do want to have your video on during the presentation, please feel free to do so. It's nicer for Daphne to feel that she's talking to an audience rather than just a screen. So if you're happy to do so, that would be great. Obviously, there's no pressure, and it's fine if you don't want to. So with that said, I think time to hand over to you, Daphne, and please do take it away.
Great, thank you so much. Again, always when you do it for the test, it works perfectly, and then when you do it actually. So let me try and let you see this. So it's getting there. There you go. So you can see this, I suppose. It's all fine. Okay, great. So thank you so much for this invite. As I was saying earlier with Rachel, we've been trying to get this happen for a while, so I'm really glad that we finally made it happen, even though it's online. I think it does have advantages. I'm really happy to see so many people here. So what I'll be presenting today, the title of my talk is Right-Wing Populism in the West, the New Nationalism Revisited. And just to give you a bit of a background quickly, I know that everybody's really excited about the US election, the thriller of the US election going on at the same time, but I will be focusing more on Europe today. Obviously, the ideas that I'm talking about are transferable because I am talking about the broader phenomenon, and indeed this the US case is something that we are pursuing at the moment in more research, but the data that I have is on Europe, and so I will be presenting data-driven material today, and that's going to be mainly on Europe. I'm really collaging various different bits of my research to put forward my own theory, if you like, of populist right, or what I prefer to call far-right party support in Europe and generally the West. This is also coming out as a book. We have a contract with Routledge, with my colleague Tim Blanders, so keep an eye out for that. But just so that I can start, obviously we're all really interested, there's so many people here who are interested in this phenomenon of the rise of the populist right or radical right or far right. And I always tend to start with this slide, because I've given many talks on this topic, which basically gives you a brief idea. This is the 2017 election, and the reason why I keep showing this slide is because the year 2017 was a year when various different national elections took place across Europe, so we can get a good idea of comparable patterns. And what we do see is more a mixed picture than most people will say. There has been some decline, and there has been some parties haven't done as well as others, but overall I think this picture really gives us a good idea of a broader rise of right-wing far-right populism across Europe. We've seen it in countries that have had this phenomenon before, like Austria with the FPÖ. We also saw it with Germany, a country that was supposed to not have any far-right party after the Second World War experience. I mean, obviously, you will remember the drama of the Front National, now Rassemblement National, getting into the second round of the French presidential election. I'm sure people looking at this slide will also say, well, some of the decline, if you look at UKIP, for example, could also be just because they have no purpose anymore since they got their agenda, right? They got the mainstream to follow them with Brexit. So perhaps why some far-right parties have declined, they have done so because they've managed to have policy impact or policy, their policies go through. But more recently, though, I have added this slide on the fall of the far-right or the populist right, because what we are seeing, again, I say this mixed picture. Recently, we saw the FPÖ did do very poorly in the Viennese local elections. We also see that some internal problems have been a bit costly for the AfD. We see the Lega in Italy also not as strong as it was. So again, there is a pattern we will see. We're all really stressed, I guess, about what's going to happen in the US. Now, whether these parties do better or a little bit worse in elections in the polls, is that our only criterion of their impact? I mean, probably also no. There is generally a trend of entrenchment. We can see this in the US, regardless of whether Trump wins or not. There is a big backing. And in Europe as well, a lot of these parties, as I said, have either declined because they've pushed their ideas in the mainstream, or they have managed to enter coalitions and have policy impact there. So why is this happening? Is this new? What is going on that is allowing so much far-right populism become so entrenched in so many different country settings? Conventional wisdom on the topic suggests that this has to do with the new nationalism. So you saw the little picture I showed in the beginning of my talk. This was the Economist cover a few years ago, sort of, this idea that restore national sovereignty, speak in the name of the people, limit immigration. This is all this phenomenon of the new nationalism, which is happening across Europe and the West. And it is caused by cultural insecurity that has been exacerbated within the context of a new transnational cleavage. This is mainly a big idea that is floating around at the moment. How do we know this? We know this, according to this literature, because immigration is a strong predictor of far-right party support. We know this because also authoritarian attitudes and values are a strong predictor of far-right party support. We know this because education is also a strong predictor of far-right party support. So what I want to do here in the next 30 minutes is challenge this conventional wisdom, and I will do so by focusing on 3 different levels. So at the individual level, which essentially we're talking about the popular attitudes and voting preferences, I want to argue that while the cultural grievance thesis basically describes some far-right voters, it doesn't describe them all. And so what we really should be looking at is a much more complex picture where different grievances of different social groups come together in voter coalitions and create these outcomes. So I will focus on 2 drivers, immigration and political trust. And the main point I want to make here is that we tend to look at statistical significance. We say, oh, if someone is got strict immigration preferences, they're more likely voters of the far right. But we tend to overlook in politics the size dimension. So we don't see how many people feel this way, and we don't see how many different voter groups come together to produce the outcome. And I think that's really problematic. The second level of analysis I'll be looking at is the meso level or party level, and this is the supply, in other words. And here I want to challenge, and I know this always creates discussion, I want to challenge the explanatory value of the term populism in telling us why it is that these parties are getting so much support. I'm going to just basically look at populism versus nationalism, so also how nationalism is used by these political parties to increase support, and I will do so by distinguishing between ethnic and civic narratives. So the main point that I want to make here is that the new nationalism indeed is important. It is not a demand side dynamic, but rather it is a supply side dynamic, and it is more useful analytically than populism. And that is because we should not assume that something that describes a party is necessarily the cause of the party's support. These parties may be talking about the people, but does that tell us why they get elected? I don't think so. I think nationalism tells us why they get elected. And then thirdly, I want to look at an also overlooked intermediate level in a way, which is the policy level. So we tend to assume that it's either demand or supply that drives support, but we focus less on the extent to which different policies are able to mediate the risks and therefore limit the risks that prompt voters to vote for the far right. So here I've done a lot of work on the role of welfare state institutions. And the point I want to make in analyzing this level is that governments do matter and they can play a role. They can change this trend by introducing policies that basically that limit people's insecurities that in turn would go to the far right. So I think there is something we can do, and that is policy related. So let me start with the first level, as I said, which is the individual grievances. Now, we know anyone interested in this topic would know that anti-immigration attitudes are probably the one thing that everybody agrees on. So they are a strong predictor of far right. I call it far right, as I said, and I'll delve into that a bit later. Anti-immigration attitudes are a strong predictor of far right party support, stronger than perhaps any other type of characteristic, right? So we know that things like gender and age and employment status, income level, all these things matter, but according to most scholars, immigration attitudes are the stronger predictor. So this is something that is indeed the case, and we can find that out from a lot of studies and surveys. But where my objection comes in is that this is automatically translated as a proxy for culture. So the fact that immigration attitudes are important automatically should mean, therefore, it is culture that drives support for these parties and not something else, not the economy, not overall satisfaction with the political system. And I think this is a problem, because immigration is a multidimensional issue. So as I'll show you in a minute, there are a lot of people who are concerned about the economic impact of immigration, or perhaps also the crime impact, or the stability and crime-related impact of immigration. Secondly, there is the question of group size, as I said earlier. Therefore, we shouldn't see only who, the fact that people concerned with immigration are likely voters of the far right, but if we delve a bit more in more detail on it, we need to see how many people within the far right electorate, how many of these people have immigration grievances, how many of these people have cultural related immigration grievances, how many of these people have economic related immigration grievances. So as I will show you in a minute with graphs, actually there is an also non-immigration related route to far right voting. So I think that the picture is much more complex than we would initially assume. So just quickly, I have a lot of graphs and I don't want to linger on them, but I just want to tell you the main point, and I'm very happy to answer any questions on this. But so what this shows you here, this is work that we have done, particularly with Tim Vlanders, on trying to disaggregate, trying to distinguish between the economic immigration skepticism and cultural immigration skepticism. And this is from European social survey data. Most of the stuff I will show you is from European social survey data. And what it does here is it shows you that you can see the blue line on the top is basically those who think that immigration is detrimental for a country's culture. Even those become far more likely to support the far right if they also have economic related immigration grievances. So the picture is so much more complex because there are significantly a lot of people who are concerned about the economic impact of immigration. This is not driven by a transnational cleavage, but rather by classic material economic concerns. I can show you this better here also from European social survey data. Now, what this shows you is the numerical point, right? So here we have distinguished between those who voted for, those who dislike the impact of immigration on the economy and voted far right, and then on the right hand side those who dislike the impact of immigration on culture. And what you can see here is that although the percentage is higher for those, it's a 21.33% of those who believe immigration's impact on culture is bad voted for the far right, numerically they're smaller. They're actually fewer voters. The percentage is just bigger because they are a smaller group, right? So I'll show you this with a hypothetical example that we have. This is from our paper in the European Political Science Review come out recently. So essentially what this means is that there is a composition effect that we are not focusing on. So let's take this hypothetical example that we created, right? You have an electorate with 110 people. some of whom are economically insecure, the majority, and then fewer are culturally insecure. You see from this example that you would be, if you follow this logic of percentage, you would say only 10% of the insecure voters, of the economically insecure voters, opted for the far right. But you can see that they are many more, right? So whereas in the culturally insecure, you only have 4 people, or 5 people, but it's 50% because your total is 10, right? So I should have said 100 of these are economically insecure and 10 of these are culturally insecure. So there is an important composition effect that is not looked at, right? There are, in simple terms, many more voters have have grievances over immigration related to the economy. And the far right knows very well, and I'll look at that in a minute, that these are the people it wants to target. And this is how we can explain, you know, the British jobs for British workers, or immigration equals unemployment, and a variety of other welfare chauvinist type of campaign materials that try to target precisely these people. So lastly on this topic, this graph shows you precisely this. Here we looked at the different levels of concerns related to immigration and how many voters across different European countries. And as you will see, in many European countries, not all, but in many, those with economic concerns over immigration are more. Okay, so in other words, they are very important for far-right party success, because a successful party cannot just have a tiny voting base. It's successful precisely because it is able to expand its voting base to peripheral voters, to voters beyond its very standard culturally insecure few. And electoral success depends precisely on this coalition. And so, as I said earlier, so what we see here, if you look at it here again, we have identified different routes to far-right voting based on different types of immigration concerns and also non-immigration concerns. You will see that 31.59, so 1/3 of the far-right electorate has no immigration-related concern. They vote for the far right for different reasons not related to immigration. And then also 15% of these also have purely economic fears. These are more than those who have the purely cultural fears, right? So there are many different routes to far right voting. And I think that in order to understand why people vote for these parties, we need to look at all these routes and not focus only on one. So let me for a second go to, you're probably feeling a bit surprised at the moment, thinking, wow, there's 1/3 of the far-right electorate who don't have immigration-related grievances. Why then do these people vote for the far-right? And I think a second under-examined issue is the issue of political trust. So we see less and less, again, we see so much about culture and immigration and less about the question of overall trust in institutions and overall satisfaction with the political system. I, as a Greek, when my country voted the Golden Dawn in its parliament a few years ago, was very surprised to see that this is not something that should be mentioned more and more, because what happened in Greece was not just some kind of cultural crisis or economic even crisis, but it was indeed an overall crisis of political representation and of democracy. So the argument here would be that to actually look at just simply economy or culture is a false dichotomy, right? Because what people do is interact in democracies, they interact on a daily basis with different institutions, and the extent to which they assess these institutions depends on their interactions. So in order to understand why people opt for these anti-systemic kind of parties, at what we call the broader social contract, right? So the fact that people and state are joined together in a contract of mutual rights and obligations, and the citizens assess the ability of the state to deliver on all these obligations, and if it doesn't deliver, it punishes it. So the citizens punish it. They punish it for not delivering by voting, by opting anti-systemic. So the argument here would be that trust and institutional efficacy shape voting preferences, and we should expect to see that individuals with high levels of trust in institutions, as well as individuals who assess the institutional efficacy positively. So by this we mean the state of health, right? The state of education. In the UK it would be, how's your NHS working? Now with COVID-19 would be an excellent time to see how much the government can be endorsed, or the state can be endorsed for the way that it is handling this kind of crisis, right? So the idea is that people who have positive evaluations of institutions and their efficacy, they would be less likely to vote for a far-right party. Now, I don't want to panic you with this. is just there to show you that what I'll say is actually used by data, or is backed by data. I haven't just come up with it. But so again, here we looked at European Social Survey data for a series of years from 2002 to 2018, and we found that indeed this is the case. So people who trust institutions and people who believe these institutions are able to deliver on the state social contract obligations are less likely to vote for the far right. But there is a caveat, and this caveat brings me back to the size question. Here what we've done, we have broken down the far right electorate in terms of where they stand on immigration, right? Given the fact that immigration, as we saw earlier, is an important driver of far right party support, we have distinguished between what we call core and peripheral far right voters based on the degree to which that they are very hardcore on their immigration positions. And we interacted this with various proxies for trust and institutional efficacy. So we looked at overall trust in institutions, institutional effectiveness, and how people judge the state of education in their country and the state of health. And what this shows you here very quickly is that for most citizens, the relationship I said earlier applies, right? So the more that these perceptions improve, the less likely they are to vote for the far right, unless they are hardcore voting base of the far right, unless they are what we call the culturalists. Those with a very hardcore positions on immigration, in fact, their propensity to vote for the far right usually increases the more they trust institutions. So this is a very interesting finding and probably has something to do with a welfare chauvinist perception, right? So our institutions, we are really hardcore far right voting base, and our institutions, we believe, function really well. So the more we want to keep them for our own ethnic group. This is one potential explanation, but I think this is an extremely interesting finding. And so the key point that I want to make here is that delving into this issue of demand in a little bit more detail does tell you something very important about the diversity of the far right voting base, right? The far right voting base, or radical right, populist right, however you want to call it, is not a homogeneous, these people are not a homogeneous group. So we should not overlook the size dynamic, right? Large electoral potential, like the percentages that these parties have been getting everywhere. I mean, even in the US, right? Even if Trump loses, we're talking about a very big group of people. They don't all vote for Trump for the same reason. We saw in Texas many blacks and Latinos voted for Trump. That's surely a very different reason why some people from North Dakota would have voted, for example, for Trump. So the far right voters are very diverse. It makes sense to distinguish between the core, those that have cultural immigration-related grievances, and that are, as I said, what we call the culturalists, very hardcore supporters, versus the peripheral ones, those with economic grievances, or protesters, those who are just protesting against a system that they believed has failed them, right? And there are very different dynamics on how to address the far right, depending on why the people actually voted for it. Okay, but just to go into, I'm sure you have many questions on this, but I look forward to hearing them. But so this is the demand, right? We have a very diverse voter base, people with economic concerns, people with immigration concerns, people with cultural concerns, and just really mad at the state for not delivering, right? So we have a very broad base. And then we have the supply. How are these parties getting voters to vote for them? Why are they voting for these parties and not something else? And I mean, an optimum question would be, well, actually, if a lot of these people have economic related grievances, as I'm arguing and some others are arguing, why is it not the populist left that has taken most votes? Yes, it's taken some votes in some places, but it's been the right that's been so successful. How is that? Isn't that a puzzle? How is that possible? Well, so what I argue here is just some very anecdotal example from some data that I saw in, I think it was The Guardian a couple of days ago, about populist attitudes declining. And I don't know how representative that is, but I just wanted to put it out there because I think a lot of people who might read this and say, oh, look, populist attitudes are declining. Does this mean that the far right will decline? Does this mean that People don't want populists in power anymore because, I don't know, the pandemic has made calls for more valence politics or more competent politics. And this would only be the case, I think, if it was populism that was driving the support, if it was the populism of the parties that was driving the support. And I beg to differ on this. I would argue that it is actually the nationalism of these parties, the new nationalism of these parties, that is driving the support. So if you look, this is also data that we have done from the Comparative Manifesto project. And if you look at that, one thing that is very clear from this graph, this just measures the programmatic agendas of different parties, right? And the salience of nationalism across the party system. And what it shows is that nationalism has indeed consistently increased in salience across the party systems of European Union member states. In other words, in simple English, these parties in their political systems, they talk a lot the nationalist talk. They talk a lot about nationalism, right? And the question is, as I said, well, and the observation is as well that, yeah, sure, and it's these nationalist parties, the parties that talk about nationalism, that have increased their voting share as well. And the question is why? So if we go out there and look empirically into why that is, I think observing these parties that have been successful gives us two insights. The first is, and here I've got this this poster from the AfD's campaign in 2017, the bikini poster. I'm sure some of you might be familiar with it. The parties that are successful are the ones that have been able to shift the boundaries of toleration from the sort of ethnic nationalism associated with fascism to the more civic nationalism, which is associated with ideology. Right, so what did the AfD do, right? It didn't say we need to get these immigrants out because they're born different to us, they're of us inferior race or anything like that. They said, no, we need to get them out because they are intolerant of our country's liberal democratic values. They don't fit in our liberal democratic society, and that they are threatening for our liberal democratic consensus. And that is something very different here. What they're saying is, we as Germans, we need to wear our bikinis. We should be free as Western European to wear our bikinis and go to our beaches. And why should we not do that? Because intolerant outsiders want to erode our values. If you look across Europe, so many parties are doing exactly that. The Swiss SVP had this also very famous black sheep, white sheep campaign. I don't know if you remember, where they portray the black sheep is kicked out of the white sheep of the Swiss flag by the white sheep, but the argument is not a racist one. It's more like the black sheep is deviant because it doesn't follow our liberal democratic values, etc., etc. So you can draw a correlation there between the parties that have done that and have succeeded electorally. Whereas the clearly fascist, clearly exclusionary, racist parties like the Greek Golden Dawn are aberrations. They're very few, and they by now have imploded, right? So the Golden Dawn is not only out of parliament, but it's also in jail, happily. And nobody wanted to join a coalition with the Golden Dawn. So you would say that the AfDs of this world are far more penetrable. They've permeated mainstream ground far more than the Golden Dawns of this world have. So that's the first feature. And then the second feature is welfare chauvinism. So again here, this is, sorry, I should have put this is the Front National, now Rassemblement National, and how much it has changed its position on welfare policies. And you can see that across time, basically, the party, especially since Marine Le Pen, has increasingly been talking about welfare status policies and increasingly trying to basically get those economically disaffected voters. So this, I would argue, is the new winning formula of the far right, the type of party that draws on civic nationalism together with welfare chauvinism to try and expand its voting base. And remember what I talked about, the supply, to capture as many groups as possible. So this little graph, I'm not going to stay long because I know I probably only have 10 minutes left or so, Rachel, and that's fine. So what I'm trying to say here is that these parties may or may not be populist, indeed. And yes, indeed, this could amount to a rhetorical style, but I don't think that is an explanatory reason as to why they are increasing their support. They are increasing their support because they are able to put forward nationalist solutions to a variety of social that create these successful voter coalitions that I mentioned earlier, right? So our party's particular feature, i.e. populism, is not necessarily a cause for its success. And I think we need to look into civic nationalism more. The idea tends to be, in the literature at least that I came out of from nationalism, that ethnic nationalism is bad and civic nationalism is good, right? And that civic nationalist ideas tend to safeguard countries from extremism. But if we are right here, then I think that there is a route to the far right that is precisely the civic nationalist route that could have very dangerous implications for the entrenchment of the far right in society, especially because it allows these parties to expand beyond their secure, narrow, culturalist voting base. And precisely for that reason, they're able to permeate mainstream ground. And so a lot of the game is now played in their court. And I think that is the biggest success of far right, that goes way beyond the electoral percentages that may go up and down every now and then. But we can do something about that, is how I want to start my final level of analysis, the policy level, right? So, and I think there is a big literature gap here that is increasingly being filled, especially by works in political economy. And this is on the policy level. So you have demand, the people that have grievances, and you have supply, the parties that fill in these grievances. But we need to look at the middle. We need to look at the institutions that are able to mitigate these grievances, and so send them as voters to something else. So policies that will break the voter coalitions. And these policies, I think, are policies, welfare state policies that try to compensate workers and to protect workers. Because these policies reduce the likelihood of supporting the far right among a variety of different individuals that are exposed to high social risks. Somebody might raise their hand here and tell me, yeah, but we know, and you've told us, that the far right voter base is far bigger than just simply, low income or unemployed. And that's precisely the point. Not only the low income or unemployed are high risk, right? So relative deprivation could affect everybody. It could affect anyone. So there are different risks that affect different people. You might think that you might get a pay cut. So you might be in an okay pay, but if your pay goes down, this is still relative deprivation. It is still a risk. COVID has created increasing risks for a lot of people. Would they be likely to vote for the far right once these economic risks are made more apparent in the aftermath of the pandemic? So what we have done here, and again, I've collaged a lot of data from a lot of work that I have done, we have tried to look at different labour market policies and see to what extent they mediate far-right party support in both European Parliament and national elections. And we have seen that indeed this is very much the case. So this is from an older paper of ours, where we basically try to look at the relationship between far-right party support and unemployment mediated by unemployment benefits. And what it simply shows, this is in the last, well, not the last now, so this is in the 2014, 2009, 2004 European Parliament elections. And simply speaking, what it tells you is that basically the unemployed are less likely to vote for the far right if unemployment benefits are generous. Okay, which means that unemployment benefits indeed make these people feel more secure. And so they don't feel the need to protest and vote for the far right. Here we did exactly the same for national elections since 1991. And we found exactly a very similar type of relationship. So again, the unemployed are less likely to vote for the far right when unemployment benefits are protective. So what about the other risk groups? As I said earlier, it's not just about the unemployed. So this is a very recent paper that we have on, where we decided that we wanted to look. So here we look at European social survey data and various databases on welfare state policies. And we have broken down a variety of different risk groups and the policies that correspond to them. So we look at pensioners and pension benefits. We look at the unemployed and unemployment benefits. We look at permanent workers and the extent to which they are supported by employment protection legislation. We look at individuals with many children and the extent to which state family policies actually make them feel more secure. The same for the minimum wage and for the permanently sick and disabled, the extent to which sickness and disability benefits actually help them. So as I said earlier, some of these policies are compensatory policies, right? So once the risk has materialized and you have become, say, unemployed, what is there to help you to restore your situation, right, to help you cope? And then there are the protection policies, which are basically the regulatory policies. And I'm not going to show you obviously all the data because I do need to finish, and that would be boring for you. But the overall trend is that indeed, and this is a long term, right? So we look at the European Social Survey data from 2002 until 2018, and we find precisely this pattern for most of the policies. So when the policy is in place, those at risk are less likely to vote for the far right. Here I show it to you for the unemployment, and I show it to you for pensions. But there's a variety of other, as I showed earlier, of other policies, and they all work, and it's really interesting. And if anyone is interested, I would be more than happy to show you some more of this data. So what is my key point here? My key point is that indeed there are grievances, but there isn't a society that doesn't have grievances, right? I'm sure that the same applies to Portugal, which only very recently just showed something, some propensity towards the far right. So long it didn't have any far right in parliament during the crisis, etc. So how about these societies? Are we assuming that if we assume that grievances always translate into far right party support, then what about the countries that don't have this kind of party? Does it mean that everybody there is happy, or maybe everybody there loves immigration? I don't think so. There is another dynamic going on, and I think that dynamic has to do, as I said, with the supply, so the party itself, and to what extent it is clever enough or strategic enough to understand that to grasp a variety of voters, essentially it's the civic nationalism winning strategy is a good strategy, and for them. And as we see, so there's a lot of imitation going on, because they also imitate each other, and once they see a party successful, then they also try to copy it and copy its narrative, right? So there is a supply mediation there, a supply side factors that matter, nationalism, and there is also a policy level mediation there, and that is about trying to limit these risk groups that have the propensity to vote for the far right. So institutions have agency, is my point here, and they can shape political outcomes. And indeed, as governments, we can do something to prevent this long trend phenomenon. So, as I said, just to conclude, putting together all my work in 40 minutes is a bit of a difficult task. But here is my theory, right? This is my theory of far right populism. It's not about the populism at all. It's about the far right. It's about political parties trying to maximize support by becoming appealing to a variety of different groups. And in order to understand their appeal, we need to look at the demand itself. So who are these people? Not only who are these people, but also how many of these people are they? And under what circumstances would they coalesce together, right? Would they vote for the same thing? How these parties basically are able to manipulate the boundaries of toleration in order to appear more appealing and not have the stigma of the fascist past, and the extent to which different labour market policies can make people feel more secure in societies and therefore not vote for these parties. So I think I will end here, and I look forward to any of your questions. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Daphne. Like you say, a lot to squeeze into 40 minutes, but really fascinating to follow along there. So yes, the floor is now open for questions. I think what we'd like to do, if you do have a question, if you could use the hand function, the raise your hand function, we'll come to you that way. If you want to speak on camera, or indeed just turn your microphone off. Equally, if you have a question but you don't want to come on screen today, just pop that in the chat, and I will follow up with those too as best I can. Okay, excellent. We have a question from Marco already, so please do go ahead.
Thank you very much, Daphne. I don't know, obviously it's been very rich talk, so I think it's quite difficult to pin down what exactly I would like to ask. Maybe a sort of general comment and maybe a question. The general comment is, to what extent obviously civic nationalism is a sort of characteristic of the far right party, when you see actually civic nationalism, basically, as you say, has become mainstream. So it's not really much the sort of label, unique label of the far right. Is something that everybody all the parties, also on the left, center left, are practicing, thinking particularly in the case of my own country, Italy. But more going towards the question, because if you read some of the reports, you see that basically what they say, you also partially present, is that the far rights are going down. There's these parties, the League in Italy, etc. There is a sort of decline. In the explanation that has been used is like, right, migration now is over with the COVID, people are no longer mobile, so if migration is going down, that's the reason why. But exactly, you are presenting the opposite argument, because it says it's not at all about migration, it's about sort of economic insecurity. So is it your expectation that in the future, what we're going to see, exactly because of the COVID, the economic crisis generated by COVID, you will see the booming of the far-right party? Is it what you anticipate?
Would you like me to respond, Rachel, or do you want to collect? How do you? Okay, wow, thank you so much for that. Right, so I guess a concern. I struggle. So what I think you raised that makes me struggle in my thinking as well is the extent to which by becoming civic nationalists, they also become mainstream, and then therefore they're not far right at all, right? And so how do we know that these parties are far right, and how do we distinguish them from other parties? And I think that here you could use this min-max understanding, right? Minimum maximum definition, right? So I think the civic nationalism we should put as a minimum, and there are other things and that we can add to make sure to understand that these parties are far right. So where else they stand on a variety of other topics. I think what does put them together, or rather what is an umbrella thing that puts all these parties together versus the others, is that they are obsessed with their immigration. Their nationalism is basically an obsession against immigration, right, in their narratives. And so every solution to society, they have become multi-issue parties in a way. So they say, oh, they have an answer for foreign policy, they have an answer for what to do with hospitals, they have an answer on what to do with education, but their answer is always, regardless of the topic, get rid of the immigrants. So they have a civic nationalist justification, but the end policy goal is get rid of the immigrants. Whereas I think that for the other parties that are not on the far right, this obsession is not there, right? So they have different solutions to different socioeconomic problems. So that could be one way of distinguishing. But I do agree with your question, Marco. I think it's a really important one, and I think conceptually we need a more systematic answer to it. The second one, when I'm always, as a political scientist, when you're asked to make predictions for the future, you think, I don't do that. I don't think I can do that. But you are right that the implications of the argument that I am making is that as long as these insecurities remain, there is always a likelihood for these parties to go well, and these parties know it very well. And that is exactly why, as I said in the beginning, they use this campaign to talk about access to jobs and access to welfare and economic position, etc., etc. So I do think that the economic difficulties that are going to follow this pandemic are going to open up opportunities for these parties to do well. Whether indeed they do well or not will also depend on other factors, though. As I said, it will depend on the kind of policies that the governments will have in place to ease the pain of those citizens who have suffered a lot and therefore will punish the incumbent or not. It will also depend on how it has also been assessed and how it's been treated. And it will also depend on the other competitors in the party system, right? Whether there is another party that will appear capable of dealing with people's economic concerns coming from a different area of the spectrum, for example, and whether they would seem competent to govern, right? So that there will be opportunities open, but it's not a done deal.
Fantastic. I see two hands up, but we also have a question in the chat, and I'm aware that Alexandra may need to go soon, so hopefully we can catch them before they do. So the two questions in the chat here. If you're right on the policy level, shouldn't these policies come not from national institutions, lest they potentially reproduce material for civic nationalism, but from, say, either regional governments or bodies like the EU? And the second question, what would you see as the take-home recommendation for parties on the left, including the so-called populist left? Should the focus be mainly on welfare policies? Is perceived economic competence critical? Is perception of not having long been historically tied with the system needed? And how should the cultural discourse be framed? Would an internationalist discourse help? So just a short question there, Daphne. If you
yes, sorry, no, is this when you read it out fast and I'm trying to follow and I don't have, so let's just take it one step at a time. So I think the first one was, if we're right about the policy, shouldn't they come from a different source? And I think that completely depends on who has legitimacy for policy making, right? And so on the one hand, if regions can make policies, that depends on whether what the country's constitution is, I guess. So yeah, sure. If a country has policy making level at the regional level, has policy making powers at the regional level, yes. If not, how are you going to do that, right? So it's a constitutional matter. Should the EU be making these policies? I don't think so. I don't think so, because the EU is already has issues. I mean, you elect a government which is legitimate to make policy, and if the EU goes on and makes policy without being legitimate in doing so, I think it will create a worse backlash. So I don't think so. And the second question now was?
It's about the take-home recommendation for parties on the left, including the so-called populist left. So where should the focus be? Would an internationalist discourse help, etc.?
So this is the other $1 million question, and something I'm asked a lot when I also give talks for NGOs and policy making think tanks or policy lobbying think tanks and stuff. And I think it's very tricky, and I think it's very tricky because in a way the left is divided in a way that the far right is not, right? So seeking their identity has been caught up or trapped somewhere in between. Should we go more on the far or on the populist, or should we go more on the mainstream? And I think that this division is really not succeeding, right? And I mean, you can see you can see it now with the US, and I don't know if by any means you would call the Democrats left, definitely not by European standards, but you could also ask yourself, how is it that despite a very bad COVID turn, Trump is still getting so much support? Why? What is going on? But I think one thing that came out of the US election is that the economy matters, right? Is that actually a lot of people who voted for Trump voted for him, in fact, for economic reasons. Voted for him because they think that he is capable of dealing with the economy, and wasn't that poll that came out and said those more concerned with COVID went for Biden, but those more concerned with the economy went for Trump. So I would say at the end of the day, maybe leave the identity politics aside and go for the policies and go for the economic policies that are actually going to help people. I think that might be the best strategy for the left.
Thank you. We have 3 hands up at the moment. How would you like to do that, Daphne? In bulk or one at a time?
Why don't I get my notepad, because I'm a visual person. So why don't you tell me the questions and then I will respond.
That sounds.
I'll write down the key so that I won't forget.
So if just the order that the hands went up. So Anthony, if you want to go first, then Lazarus, and then Panos, if you just either turn your mic on or your mic in your video and go ahead with your questions.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely. Hi there.
Hello. Hi. Thanks very much for a very interesting talk. So my question was mainly about this kind of teasing out of sort of economic and cultural grievances. So I wondered to what extent you see in the data that sort of these are groups that kind of overlap when we think about the basins of far right support, let's say, or right-wing nationalist support. Are we kind of primarily talking about the same group of people, and it's just that there's sort of people at the margins who fall outside of the kind of cultural grievance, but they have economic grievances, or vice versa? Or are there more distinctions to be made? And then when we think about then teasing out the effect of vulnerability, like, have you done work where you kind of, to what extent have you been able to kind of tease out the vulnerability effects from sort of more racial grievances or things like that? Like, especially we see in sort of like North American literature that this is up a lot about, like, how can we best measure vulnerability, and then how can we best measure sorts of like racial resentment or things like that. So that was kind of where my questions were mainly headed, and then sort of then how that might connect in with these potential for the welfare state to address these things, right? Can we think of the welfare state as sort of undercutting potential racial resentment too before it comes up or when it starts to come up, and these sorts of teasing up these relations? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Could I just jump in quickly and say, Daphne, would you mind stopping the screen share so the guys can see your video?
Sure.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, sorry, the next question I believe was from Lazarus, if you want to go ahead.
Hello, hi. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Unfortunately, my camera is off, has some issues. I had a couple of questions, short ones. The first one was in regard with the whole about civic nationalism. My understanding, especially because you mentioned AFD, my understanding is that in some instances, and from the recent literature that's been around, that they may use, these parties may use a form of civic nationalism or presenting themselves as the champions or defenders, let's say, of liberal democratic institutions, while in fact this serves as a facade to hide some, let's say, more far-right policies, attitudes, discourse that they have. Case in point with the AFD and the wing, which is the most radical part of the party, and they have been very anti-Semitic. They had very, very ambiguous comments, and I would like your comment on that. And the thing connects to this, to the first one, is about classifying Golden Dawn as a nationalist party, because I've seen this also elsewhere, and there is a tendency to call it a nationalist party when in fact it's a Nazi party in its core. And there is, I think, some differentiation between, for example, Golden Dawn and, for example, let's say Front National. I don't know what you think about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Fab. And then Panos, you had your hand up too, so if you want to add your question to the mix.
Yep, thank you, and thank you, Daphne, for this presentation. My own question has something to do with the term populism, and you mentioned that at the end that far-right populism is not about populism at all, and I totally agree with that. I was wondering where then do you see populism in this party family? Because one could say that the key element here is not populism, but possibly ethnic nationalism or exclusionary nationalism or nativism and so on, because these parties are mostly defined by these elements and not populism, which perhaps brings us to the definition of populism and nationalism, and perhaps I was wondering if you want to say something about, how do you see, how do you use this term populism? Thanks.
Thank you. Wow. Okay. Thank you, because now you're going to give me the opportunity to say how I understand the term. But let me start first with the first question. So thank you for that. And indeed, so just to be brief, yes, indeed, culture and economy overlap, right? So the cultural and economic, those with cultural concerns are also likely to have economic concerns and vice versa, and there is an overlap there, but the overlap is not total. So in other words, everything is correlated, right? And it all might depend on a different thing. Like the education one has perhaps also relates to how they feel about culture, economy, and other things, or the economic status of a person might also impact on their education and then their cultural perceptions, etc., etc. So I think that while there is overlap, however, they are also distinct groups. So some of these people are distinct groups. So I think it does make sense to look at them in groups. I'm thinking through this because I want to create my conceptualization, and in a way I see far-right support. I would draw if I was there, but I would see it as different bubbles, right? So in the core center I would put what I call the culturalists, which are those who have serious cultural concerns, and those concerns are probably race related, right? The ethnic nationalists. And then the bigger bubble would be the culturalists, but not necessarily only race related, just broadly worrying about the norm consensus in their society. So these would be the core voters. And then the bigger bubble from that would be those concerned with the economic impact of immigration, and bubble would be the overall protesters concerned with their state delivering on the social contract obligation, trust, etc., etc. So this is how I would conceptualize core and different peripheral voters. And I think that while they do, some of them might overlap, it does make sense to look at them as also distinct. Secondly, very quickly on vulnerability. So as I said, the work that I've presented so far is mainly on Europe. And so what we have done is we've looked at vulnerability just in terms of different social risks. So we have identified, as I showed, the different risk groups who might be, people on pensions or people on disability benefits, etc., etc. And we've seen which policy might lower the risks. But that is just where we are with vulnerability, and we haven't looked at North American literature at all. The second question, or the second person first question, I would agree with you that it doesn't mean that if the parties are putting forward a civic narrative that they are actually civic, and in a way, who knows what they really think, and it's outside the scope, right, of the research. I mean, indeed, a lot of them might be hardcore racist, and who knows what goes on behind closed doors. What we're talking about here is their communication strategy, right? And I think that the people that vote for them also at least not all of the people who vote for them necessarily worry always about their true colors, if you like. And this is also the case for other parties. So even a mainstream right party, you're Greek, so I think you know our mainstream right, for example, it has many factions in itself. So there is a more right-wing element of the party and a more centrist element of the party. That probably goes for the far right as well. They have a more hardcore element and they have a more moderate element, and on and on and on. So I think the extent to which they truly are racist behind their civic nationalist facade is maybe true, but also outside the scope of my research. The second question of the second person who asked the question is related to the third question. So what I will do is I will try to link these together. So with regards to the far right, I understand the far right as an umbrella that puts together parties that all put forward nationalist solutions to socioeconomic problems. So in a way, I depart from Moody's definition, if you like, by not just looking at populism, authoritarianism, and nativism. But what I argue is that what all these parties have in common is that they throw a nationalist answer to whatever question you pose to them about society, right? Whatever your problem is, their answer is a nationalist answer. This is how we know they are far right. Within this umbrella, however, there are the more extreme and the more radical, the more moderate variants. The extreme variants are ones that do so by following an ethnic nationalist narrative. So they will tell you all immigrants out, race is the thing that is the biggest, of the most important, irredentis foreign policy, etc., etc. The Golden Dawn fits in this category, right? As do fascists. Because the Golden Dawn, as you say, I agree, is neo-Nazi. And what is neo-Nazi, if not that type of nationalism? So I think the Golden Dawn fits in that category, whereas on the other hand, the more radical variants, what Golder would call the new far right, I call the civic far right, which are those that basically put forward this narrative of liberal toleration. I'm not saying that that's what they are, I'm saying that that's what they say. Why not populism? So here's why not. I think, so for me, the useful literature when we look at populism is literature from a while ago that basically understands populism not just as a narrative or as a discourse that talks about the difference between people and the elites, because I think that's every party in a democracy does that. I was listening to Biden yesterday when he made one of his talks in this thriller sort of campaign, and how many times the American people came up in that talk was unbelievable. If you did not know it's Biden, but you know it's Biden, so you look at it, okay, he's not a populist, that's fine. But if you didn't know, if I played you a little sound, or if I wrote it to you and I showed you that paper without telling you who it was, you would say he's populist, right? This person who said that is a populist. Translation: it is very difficult to tell the populist from the non-populist, because everybody talks about the people in a democracy. Takes us back to the minimum maximum. So what's more helpful? So here I look at the older literature, and I think Riker's in particular, and I'm really surprised that Riker is not often used in literature on populism, is very useful, because what he says is essentially populism is not about just a discourse of the people and the elite. It's not just about a dichotomy in society, but what it's really about is a system of how to make collective decisions. And what he says is that the only way, according to populists, to make collective decisions is to make them from below. The only right decisions are those made by the people, which begs the question, who are the people? This is why fascists are the quintessential populists, precisely because fascism eradicates any distinction, any individuality among the people. They are purported to be one thing, and they are purported to be, therefore, because they are the one thing, the state can become one and the same with the people, so and its will. Right, and which is why I think that actually populism might be, if you like, more useful in understanding fascists and understanding the Golden Dawn than necessarily it is in understanding the more moderate variants, which is the way that we look at this today. But even if we adopt the definition that we look today, I don't think it's helpful to go back to Panos's question, precisely because the counterfactual is really difficult to identify. I think everybody can be a populist, depending on how we stretch the definition, which leaves us, so far-right populist versus far-left populist, you know, versus mainstream populist, PASOK populist, church populist. It must be then the other attribute of the party that describes that is the cause of the party's success, right? Not populism, since populism is a constant. So I would say that is why I say that nationalism is more useful.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Herculean answering session there. That was great. Folks, we are now past 2 o'clock, and we completely understand that some people may need to go. Daphne's already said that she has a few more minutes to hang around, and we do have an additional question. So if you need to leave, of course, we understand. But if you're still happy to do that, Daphne, we have a question from Michael. So please go ahead.
Thanks very much for the talk, Daphne. Two quick questions. One, what's new about the new nationalism? And then the second one, I was quite intrigued to see you bringing the ethnic-civic divide back in. I thought that had been put to bed a while ago. And I was just wondering, the example you gave of the burqa bikini poster on the lamppost, I mean, that strikes me as a classic example of ethnic, because it's about culture. And yet you were talking about it as if it was a civic form of nationalism. So just explain a bit more about how that divide is still useful for understanding this, please. Thank you very much.
Super. Thanks, Michael. Yeah, so what's new about the new nationalism? The supply is the quick answer. So whereas most people would suggest at this stage that it is the new nationalism is a demand side, so new nationalism means new transnational cleavage, therefore new nationalist demand side dynamics, I guess my quick answer is what's new about the new nationalism is that it is now a nationalism that can attract more people, because this type of nationalism, A, allows the parties to distance themselves from their fascist past, so the fascist past and the stigma of fascism that comes with it, and B, because they are able to attract a much broader electoral base. So that's what's new about this nationalism. Now, why is the bikini campaign civic and not ethnic? Well, it's interesting that you would say that, because to me it's so obviously civic, and here's why, right? Precisely because it's something that you can become, being this person who now takes off the burqa and wears the bikini and goes to the beach is a choice at the end of the day, is what these people would say, right? You're not necessarily born, you're not born with the burqa. You make the choice of adhering to particular values, and therefore these are changeable. Whereas ethnic nationalism is about something that is immutable, right? You are born with something that you cannot, your race is something that the color, the common descent, right? It's something that you cannot take out. Like, obviously these boundaries are blurred, obviously, because you can say, well, you know, if this is the culture that you've been born and raised with, how are you going to shed it off? How are you going to change? And so this is why the way that these actors present it also plays an enormous role. And here I want to talk about, I don't know if you're familiar with it at all, but there's the SVP, the Swiss SVP did this campaign with the white sheep, black sheep that I talked about. And exactly the same campaign was put forward by the German NPD a while ago as well. Also, it's the black sheep. So it's basically a flag of the country, white sheep on the flag, and they're kicking out a black sheep. Exactly the same image. And it is really interesting to see the way that the two different actors portrayed it. In the way that the German party portrays it is so ethnic. They're basically, I think their caption was, "We're cleaning out." Extremely racist way of saying it. And so you get a message out of that. But then the Swiss SVP put all this narrative around it, how it's all about the black sheep is not about its color at all, but it's about it being deviant and not aspiring to values and things that are changeable. Right. So the way that they portrayed it was that something very civic. So I think, you know, what comes with the bikini campaign, even if you're not convinced by my interpretation, is also to see how the party itself portrays it and justifies its narrative. I hope this answers your question.
And I think somebody's kindly posted that poster you were talking about in the chat there. So
oh, thank you.
Visual evidence for us too.
Oh, wow. Yeah, thank you so much.
So I think that exhausts our questions for the moment, but let me say on behalf of us all, thank you so much for an incredibly interesting talk, a kind of different perspective on these old problems that we talk about so often. So thank you again for your time today, Daphne, very much appreciated. And there's a lot of love in the comments as well if you get a chance to see those. So our next talk in the seminar series will be taking place next Friday on the 13th, same time. This is with Dr. Katie Featherston, and she'll be talking about communicating the rules of the acute hospital ward to people living with dementia and its consequences. So again, just evidence. We cover a whole broad swathe of topics here at the CRCC. But again, so very grateful to you today, Daphne, for turning up digitally and giving us this talk today. So thanks again, everyone, and do take care. Hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for your questions. Bye.